Look at page 542. There are some definitions that you need to know. The first one is the inverse sine, and it gives you the range, which means that those are the angles that you look at. Basically, we're looking at acute angles. So you look from negative 90 degrees, and remember, if this is 0 and this is 90, pi over 2, remember that going in the positive direction is this way. Well, going from 0 this way is the negative direction. So this is negative 90 degrees, or negative pi over 2. So we're only looking at the unit circle in that place. Those are the only things we're looking at. So we're looking at negative 90 degrees, negative 60 degrees, negative 45, negative 30, 0, 30, 45, and 90. That's what's on our unit circle in this area. That's what we see. So if we were going to build a table of values, it would have these values on it for the unit circle. So if we take a look at example 2, it says the inverse sine of negative 1. So if I go over here, and I'm going to pull up my unit circle, if I go over here and I look at my unit circle, remember that the sine value is the y value. Well, none of the y values are going to be negative in the first quadrant. So if I look down here, the y value that's negative is this one, and it's at 330 degrees, but we want from negative 90 all the way to positive 90. So if I'm looking at this and 360 is here, this would be backing up 30 degrees, so this would be negative 30 degrees, which is right here. So we would be looking at negative 30 degrees. And if we're looking at negative 30 degrees, let me pull my little whiteboard back up. Negative 30 degrees, if I wanted to change that to radians, I would have pi over 180. 30 goes into 180 6 times, so this would be negative pi over 6. So when you're looking at example 2a, and it says inverse sine of 1/2, if it's negative 1/2, the only thing that you have that is negative 1/2 is that negative pi over 6. But if it says inverse sine of positive, which is what the example says, 1/2, and I go and I look at my unit circle, the only things where y is positive 1/2 is in the first quadrant, remember from negative 90 to positive 90, would be this one, and it would be pi over 6. So the answer to that one, because it says positive 1/2, would be positive pi over 6. So that's the difference in these two. If I put a negative on it, it makes that one negative simply because that's the only one on the unit circle. Go back and look at it. That has a negative y value, and it wants the acute angles. So this would be negative 30 degrees, which would be negative pi over 6. So that's example 2a on page 543. So if we're looking at 2b, it says inverse sine of negative square root of 2 over 2. So let's go back to my unit circle. Sine value is the y value. This is the only one that's negative square root of 2 over 2. If I'm going this way, this is 30. This is 45. So this is negative 45 degrees. If I change 45 to radians, I would have pi over 4. So my answer would be negative pi over 4. On 2c, it says inverse cosine of negative square root of 3 over 2. Cosine is the x value, so I'm looking for negative square root of 3 over 2. That is the x value. And if you'll look on page 542, the range that we're looking at for inverse cosine is 0 to pi. So for that one, we want to look from 0 all the way to pi, which is right here. So if I'm looking at inverse cosine of negative square root of 3 over 2, the only negative square root of 3 over 2 that is in the x value is this one. And it is clearly labeled as 5 pi over 6. So that would be my answer for that one. For 2D, I have inverse tangent of 1. So it's saying what angle does that come from? And the range that we're looking at for tangent, again, is negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. And it is not including, if you'll look at it, it's written this way on page 542. Negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. It has parentheses around it, and from 171 you learn that that means that these two endpoints are not included. So it's everything on my unit circle, not including the negative 90 and the 90 because tangent's undefined there. So it's this bottom half from negative 90 all the way up to positive 90. So it's the right side of the unit circle. And in order for tangent to be 1, I would need to have my cosine and my sine to be the same. So looking at that right-hand side of the unit circle, the only place that my sine and the cosine are the same is right here, because I need to divide by itself to get a 1. And so that's at pi over 4. And if I look down here, they're the same, but they're opposite signs. So when I divide opposite signs, I get a negative, and I'm looking for a positive 1 for that answer. So if I had said, let's pull my whiteboard up, let's say I had said inverse tangent of negative 1. That would give me on my unit circle, that would give me this one, but it wants to go from negative 90 to positive 90. So if I'm going backwards, from 0 to 11 pi over 6 would be negative 30, and then negative 45. So negative 45 degrees would be negative pi over 4. So on that one, my answer would be negative pi over 4 if it had been a negative 1. So if you're trying to get the exact answers, you need to pay attention. So you need to make sure you have in your notes the range that you have for the inverse sine function, the inverse cosine function, and the inverse tangent function. And that is on page 542.